Good morning. Good morning. We're going to be starting off in Numbers chapter 13 today. We're going to be talking a little bit about giants. Usually when we have a sermon or a message or a study on something giants related, we're comparing the giants of the Bible to the giants in our lives. We tell stories of David and Goliath and how with God's help he was able to defeat this giant. And our giants today might be a scary situation. They might be something dangerous. It might be something, just a potentially fearful storm in life. And we're encouraged by these stories where with God's help, a little boy like David can take a sling and a stone and defeat the giant. Because God's the one who goes before us, and God's the one who empowers us to do these things. God's the one doing the work. And our giants today might be a medical scare. Our giants today might be financial problems or losing a job or losing a loved one. It's not very likely that we're going to walk down a dark alley and run face to face with somebody who's 3 times our size, like could have happened in this day. Our giants are just the things that are either big in life or things that we make big in our mind. Now, at this time, God had defeated a massive giant for the Israelites. He freed them from slavery in Egypt in a spectacular way. He freed them from Egypt. He parted the sea to help them get out and away from the Egyptians. And within, I don't know the exact timeline, about a year or so, they had reached this promised land that he had promised to lead them to. But we know they wandered the desert for 40 years. Think about that. They got there within about a year or less, but still ended up wandering the desert for 40 years. They got there, wandered, and the next generation came back. So what happened? I'm going to start off in Numbers chapter 13, verses 1 and 2. They just gotten to the land, and they wanted to scope things out and see what they were in for. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Send men out to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the children of Israel. From each tribe of their fathers you shall send a man, every one a leader among them." So these are God's recon instructions. This is God giving them instructions on how to do this. These men were sent out on a recon mission. They were going to scope out the land of Canaan and report back to the rest of the Israelites. They were going to see if the land was good to live in, if it was good for crops. They were going to see if it was safe to live there. They were going to spy on the Canaanites and see what kind of military strength they had. It sounds like a pretty wise thing to do, right? Sounds like a good plan. Let's see what we're up against. But what if it wasn't God's plan? What if I told you all this spying wasn't God's idea? You say, well, how can that be? God just sat here and told them what to do. Didn't this passage, the Lord spoke to Moses and said, "Send men out to spy out the land." Well, I want to skip to Deuteronomy chapter 1 for a moment. Hold your place. And I want to read verses 20 through 24. "And I said to you, you have come to the mountains of the Amorites, which the Lord our God is giving us. Look, the Lord your God has set the land before you. Go up and possess it. As the Lord God of your fathers has spoken to you, do not fear or be discouraged. And every one of you came near to me and said, 'Let us send men before us, and let them search out the land for us, and bring back word to us of the way by which we should go up, and of the cities into which we shall come.' The plan pleased me well," this is Moses speaking, The plan pleased me well, so I took 12 of your men, one man from each tribe, and they departed and went up into the mountains and came to the valley of Eshcol and spied it out. So what does it say in this passage? Just a quick rundown. It's land that the Lord our God is giving us. He's instructing them, go up and possess it, the land. Don't be afraid. Do not fear. Don't be discouraged. And what do they say back to him? Let's send men before us. He's already saying, God's taking care of this for you. Just go take it and don't be afraid. And they're saying, let's check this out. Maybe we better look into this real quick. And Moses said, this plan pleased me well. So while God is giving instruction back here in Numbers on how to go about doing this, he's basically letting them have their way in the way that they wanted to go about things. He's just instructing them on how to do it. Kind of like when they wanted a king so badly, and he gave them guidance on getting King Saul. They weren't happy with what they had. They weren't happy with the kind of leadership they had, so they pushed for a king. And he said, all right, well, if you want it so bad, here you go. This is how we're going to do this. God said, I've got this land for you. Here it is. Just take it. Don't be afraid. And they said, let's not be too hasty, God. So he gives them this instruction on what to do and how to go about spying on the land. And really, the Israelites were really sending these spies to look for proof of God's promises. It makes you want to shake some sense into them, doesn't it? But how often do we do that ourselves? How often does God call us to something and then we kind of feel the need to work out our own logistics on how it might be possible, or maybe we need to figure out for ourselves whether it's possible at all. We filter God's promises through our own fears and through our own doubts. They questioned God. They doubted God. They were placing their trust in what seemed possible, instead of placing their trust in the God for whom nothing is impossible. Yes, I would definitely call them foolish, but in doing so, I'd have to admit that I'm foolish too. I'm the same kind of fool. And I'm guessing most people would. Sometimes no matter what God tells us or tries to lead us to, we try to talk ourselves out of it or scare ourselves out of it. We convince ourselves that, well, I'm just being smart about how I should go about this. And really, sometimes we're saying, maybe I can figure out a way to get out of this. God led the Israelites out of Egypt. He parted a sea so they could escape on dry land. He let it come crashing back together and wipe out an Egyptian army, and he fed them and guided them all the way through this desert to get to this promised land, and they still struggled with doubt. Verses 3 through 16 list out all the individual names of the spies that they would be sending out from each tribe. And what this was doing, he was sending a leader from among each tribe, so that way the whole of the nation was represented. Whatever came from this, no tribe could say that they weren't represented in the decision or in the spying in this process. I want to go to verse 17 through 20. It says, Then Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan and said to them, Go up this way into the south and go up to the mountains and see what the land is like. Whether the people who dwell in it are strong or weak, few or many, whether the land they dwell in is good or bad, whether the cities they inhabit are like camps or strongholds, whether the land is rich or poor, and whether there are forests or not. Be of good courage, and bring some of the fruit of the land. Now the time was the season of the first ripe grapes. So let's look at the highlights here of what he's instructing the people to go and check out. What is the land like? Are the people strong or weak? Are there a few people or are there many people? Is the land good or bad? How fortified are the cities? Is it just a weak little town or is it like a fortress? Is the land rich or poor? Are there forests Bring back some fruit. We need proof. It's basically what he's saying here. How strong are the people? How many people are there? Why does that matter when God's the one bringing the victory? How many people does it take to outnumber God? How powerful do the people need to be to defeat God? Is the land good or bad? Did God already promise it was good? Whose influence do you see creeping in here? What did he say in the garden? Did God really say you can't eat any of the fruit? Can't eat from all the trees? Did God really say that? Seeds of doubt. Did God really say the land was good? You might want to go see for yourselves. I don't know if I trust that. Did God really say that this land was going to be yours? You better go see what kind of enemy you're going to be up against. You better see if there's too many people for you to defeat. You better see if they're too strong for you to win against. See, he uses the same old playbook. And one of his biggest deceptions is getting people answering the wrong questions. Instead of just being secure in the knowledge that God has this victory, God can't be defeated, he's answering the question, can you beat them? I can't do that. No, I'm not likely to win against a powerful enemy. I'm not able to do the impossible, but I don't have to. That's God's job. That's what God does. I don't have to do the impossible. I don't have to beat powerful enemies, and neither did they. But that's where their eyes were turned. That's where their focus was. Don't get sidetracked by Satan trying to answer the wrong questions. Keep your focus on God, who does the impossible all the time, on our behalf, like it's nothing. Verses 21 through 25, we see how their little mission went. So they went up and spied out the land from the wilderness of Zin as far as Rehob, near the entrance of Hamath. And they went up through the south and came to Hebron. Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, descendants of Anak, were there. Now Hebron was built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. Then they came to the valley of Eshcol, and there they cut down a branch with one cluster of grapes, and they carried it between the two of them on a pole. They also brought some of the pomegranates and figs. The place was called the Valley of Eshcol because of the cluster which the men of Israel cut down there. And they returned from spying out the land after 40 days. Now, I want to think about that. Think about the significance of these grapes. This seems like a minor detail to add to a story. I mean, they went and they grabbed some fruit. I feel like there's some more significance to it than that maybe you might not notice right off the bat. What does this signify? What did God promise them about the land? The land was good. The land was bountiful. The land was going to provide everything they needed. And they're doubting him, and he's saying, here, take this bunch of grapes that's so big that it takes 2 men and a pole to carry it. Now, I like grapes. Someone else in my house likes grapes a lot more than me. And when we buy grapes, it's a little bag like this, about that big. And it costs a fortune, even at that size. I can't imagine having a bunch of grapes so big that you had to slide a pole through it and have 2 full-grown men carry this thing. God's saying, see, how much more do I need to show you? I'm going to take care of you here. You're not going to be just surviving off scraps. I'm going to be providing bountifully. It was just as good as God promised and better than they realized it was going to be. And really, they were just wasting their time doing a job that God had already done. Ezekiel 26. God says, on that day I raised my hand in an oath to them to bring them out of the land of Egypt into a land that I had searched out for them, flowing with milk and honey, the glory of all lands. They're like, let's go check this land out. God already did it. And he told them. And they didn't trust. Verses 26 through 29. Now they departed and came back to Moses and Aaron and all the congregation of the children of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. Then they told him and said, we went to the land where you sent us. It truly flows with milk and honey. Who could have guessed? It truly flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Nevertheless, the people who dwell in the land are strong. The cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land to the south. The Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites dwell in the mountains. And the Canaanites dwell by the sea along the banks of the Jordan. You see what they're doing here? They're giving them the pros and the cons. Saying, oh yeah, it's just like God told us. It's an abundant land. It's flowing with milk and honey. Look at this fruit. It's great. But nevertheless means despite all that, God promised that we've got this. God promised that it's this wonderful place that's going to be plentiful and it's ours and there's nothing to fear. But nevertheless, it looks pretty dangerous. Nevertheless, the people who dwell in the land are strong. They have fortified cities. What's the significance of the descendants of Anak? Basically, there's giants there. Now, maybe these weren't as big as some of the giants because maybe that was the whole point of describing them as the descendants. Maybe they were, bigger than the average person, but not necessarily a skyscraper tall. But they're planting seeds of doubt. It says that they came before the whole congregation. This wasn't their church, this was the nation. They're coming back and reporting before all the people. Yes, there's great stuff there, just like God says, but the cities are like fortresses and the people are pretty big. So what happens in verse 30? One of the spies, Caleb, decides to shut them up. He says, then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and take possession, for we are well able to overcome it. He sees what they're doing. He sees the doubt that's starting to get cast because of what they're saying, and he's quiet. He's like, hey, this is enough. Let's do this. Let's take what God has given to us already. He's the one voice speaking up in faith. And I think that scared them a little more because then they start embellishing a little more on their story. Verses 31 to 33. But the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. And they gave the children of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants. And all the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature. There we saw giants. The descendants of Anak came from the giants. And we were like grasshoppers in our own sight. And so we were in their sight. Now, I'm not sure how to take exactly the word bad in this. Because if you look at different translations and you read different commentaries, that's not always the word used. This is the New King James. It says they gave a bad report. King James says they gave an evil report. Other ones say they gave a false report. Now, a lot of lies are seasoned with some truth. So it's not that there weren't giants there, but it's probably that they weren't big enough to make the people look like grasshoppers. They're over-embellishing what's happening here. They're giving a report that is not trustworthy, a report that is over-exaggerated because they're probably afraid Caleb's going to talk some sense into people and say, no, let's go and take possession. We're able to do this. They're like, hang on, I don't know. We look like grasshoppers next to these guys. We're microscopic next to these giant people. But notice what he says. They're stronger than we. It doesn't matter. They're not stronger than God. There we saw the giants. We were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. I'm not going to go through all of chapter 14, but if you read through it, you're gonna see the aftermath of this. God wasn't happy with the people. They chickened out, they doubted him, they trusted him, and he lets them have it. He says, this whole time I've been freeing you from slavery and leading you and meeting your every need and feeding you, and all you've done is complain. You complained about the kind of food I gave you. You complained about wandering the desert. You complained about what you're going to face in this land. And he says, you know what? You're not going to see it. You're not going to see it. Some of you are going to see it. A few of you are going to see it. Caleb got to see it. Joshua got to see it. But the majority of them didn't get to see it. The next generation got to see it. He said, you know what? Your generation is going to go back out. You're going to go back out and wander the desert. Your generation is going to die there in the desert. And your next generation is going to get to go into this land. They're the ones who are going to inherit this promised land that you could have had if you would have just trusted me. They might not have made them look like grasshoppers, but there were giants there. And the giants won. The giants won without even knowing it. The giants won without ever putting up a fight, without lifting a finger, without saying a word. They didn't even know they were in a battle. These people came and spied and left and decided they lost. The giants only won because the people decided to lose. They were afraid of the what-ifs. They doubted God because of the what-ifs. They led other people to fear and doubt because of the what-ifs. And nearly everyone lost out because of it. Don't we do that with our giants sometimes? We think what if so hard that we build it up to the point we feel like grasshoppers in their sight. Moses wasn't off the hook. He said in verse 123, the plan pleased me well, so I took 12 of your men, one man from each tribe. He got close to the promised land, but he never got to enter it. I titled this sermon, Letting Giants Win, because that's exactly what the Israelites did. And too often it's exactly what we do. We let the giants win. We get in our own heads. We let the giants win without even facing them. Whatever the situation might be, we let scary situations, we let scary hypotheticals that may or may not happen. Probably won't happen the way we imagine them. May not happen at all. But we turn our eyes from God and we start staring at these giants that we're imagining, that we create in our own heads a lot of times. Too often it's the somewhat big issues. It's the things that could get big. That we over embellish mentally. That we do this to the point that we see ourselves as grasshoppers next to them. Look at this. There we saw the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight. And so we were in their sight. We were like grasshoppers in our own sight. We saw ourselves as grasshoppers next to these giants. And that's what fear can do to you. It can shrink you down inside. It can shrink down your confidence and your hope. Like God constantly tells us through Scripture, fear not, don't be afraid, don't be anxious about anything. But sometimes we do have giants that are so big in our lives that we're like a grasshopper next to them. Sometimes we do face things that dwarf us next to them. Massive giants of situations in our life. That we're tiny next to them, but God isn't. And that's when we need to trust in Him the most. We need to trust Him throughout all these situations. If we were trusting in Him before we over-embellish these things in our head, we wouldn't lose sight and worry about them as much as we do. But these giants are grasshoppers next to God. These giants would look at God and feel tiny and insignificant because they are compared to him. You need to think, what has God gotten you through at one point or another? Think about the worst or the hardest thing you've ever experienced in your life. I mean, the most down in the dumps, the most scared or miserable or desperate or whatever it may have been. And no matter what that was, the truth is you're still here. God didn't let you be consumed. I'm not implying that these things are insignificant. I'm not implying that they don't get ugly. But God didn't let them end you. He got you through it. And I'm willing to bet that after he did, it strengthened your confidence in him. So, when you do see a new giant coming at you, and you probably will, start thinking about those old ones. Think about those old ones that God stepped on like a grasshopper. Remember the ones that you've survived. Remember the giants that you've faced and won. And the God who got you through it. The God who made it all possible. Chapter 14, it talks about the way these people would not get to enter the land in their generation, and that they were going to wander the desert for 40 years. And God says, you know what? Your carcasses are going to be in the desert. You're going to die in a dried up, desolate desert place. They're going to die in the wilderness. And there's freedom in trusting God. And the more you trust him, the more you're going to understand that, and the more you're going to experience it. But there's freedom in wholly trusting God. There's hope in trusting God. There's life in trusting God. Not just saying you trust him, I mean really trusting him. We can either wander through life aimlessly in a mental desert like these people did, or an emotional desert filled with fear and doubt until the day that we die. In this wilderness, in this deserted, in this dried up place, in a dried up mind or heart of fear. Or we can trust God and have an abundant life. And that trust has to start with trusting in Jesus. That journey starts with trusting and accepting Jesus. And once you do, God's going to start changing your life in ways that build that trust greater and greater and greater, to the point when a giant tries to creep in, all you see is how big your God is. We need to keep our trust and our focus on God.